Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Aiden Skids, and I'm the director of the Kennedy Political Union at American University. Today, I have the honor of introducing this afternoon's event, A View from the Top, a conversation with Jeff Zients, the current White House Chief of Staff for President Biden. Before introducing our guest speaker, I'd like to thank all the university partners that helped make this event possible, including the Zients Institute of Policy and Politics, the School of Public Affairs, and the Kogod School of Business. Without the support of these partners, programs like this simply would not happen. We're grateful for the opportunity to engage in this conversation today. Let's give them all a warm round of applause. Now, I'd like to introduce this afternoon's guest speaker, Jeff Zients. As previously mentioned, Jeff currently serves as the White House Chief of Staff for President Biden. Prior to this role, Jeff served extensively in both the public and private sectors. In the business world, he has founded the investment firm Portfolio Logic. He has served as chairman, CEO, and COO of the advisory board company, and most recently he served as CEO of the Cranemere Group. In his transition from the private sector to the public sector, Jeff has directed the White House Office of Management and Budget. He's directed President Obama's National Economic Council, and he was President Biden's COVID-19 response coordinator before taking on his current role as Chief of Staff. Jeff is also a recipient of an honorary degree from American University in 2018. Moderating today's discussion is David Marchick, Dean of AU's Kogod School of Business. Under Dave's leadership, Kogod has unveiled major initiatives in sustainability, AI, entrepreneurship, and he has encouraged greater public-private sector collaboration in AU's academic model. Prior to joining the AU community, Dave served as the Chief Operating Officer of the United States Development Finance Corporation in the Biden administration, where he managed agency priorities, oversaw business operations, and led the agency's work to support the manufacturing of more than 2 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines in the developing world. Both Dave and Jeff's careers exemplify precisely AU's strength, endowing leaders with the skills and interests to do well in both the public and private sectors. On that note, it is my honor to welcome David Marchick and Jeffrey Zients.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeff. I just want to thank everybody for coming. Is the mic okay? Thank President Alger, Provost Wilkins. We have other senior members of the leadership. We have several trustees. Mark Duber, Stuart Bernstein, Ambassador Stuart Bernstein, I'm sorry for calling you Stuart.
Only my wife has to call me Your Excellency.
Okay. And Jeff has been a longtime friend. I'm really grateful for you being here. There's nothing going on at the White House today. I assume that if there were a strike in the ports, conflict in the Middle East, and you and the president, the vice president working on hurricane recovery, you wouldn't have been here, but thank you for being here.
We're
really
thank you.
grateful.
It's an honor to be here.
And thanks to all the students for coming. It's wonderful. I'm getting just a little feedback on the mic. Wonderful to have such a great experience for the students. So let's start in with your background. So for those of you who don't know, where did you grow up, and how did you end up becoming White House Chief of Staff?
So I grew up 3 miles away, Connecticut Avenue in the Beltway. I used to study, I don't know if it was legal or illegal, but I used to study in the AU library when I attended high school. Just this morning, tried to come to the track to run. Little did I know that was under construction. So I'm now a neighbor. I live just a couple blocks away. But I grew up around here. I was always interested in business growing up, newspaper routes, baseball card collections that I would then turn around and sell. Lawn businesses and all the rest. I ended up going from here to Duke, where I was, of all things, a political science major. I didn't think that was ever going to come in handy, but lo and behold, it did. Was at Duke for that 4-year period of time and took as many classes as I could in the equivalent business school, Fuqua. So as an undergrad, you were allowed to take 5 classes at Fuqua. You couldn't major in business, but you could take 5 classes, so I maxed out there. In my senior year, I stumbled upon this thing called management consulting. I had no idea what it was, and I was lucky enough to get a job at a place called Bain & Company in Boston, and did a couple of years at Bain, really enjoyed it, But unlike most of my classmates, I did not apply to business school and go on to business school. For some reason, I decided I wanted to try some entrepreneurial things. I quickly, almost in record time, went 0 for 2 in entrepreneurial ventures. So I was like 23, 24 years old. Hey, Tom. I was 0 for 2, so I figured time to come home. Came back to D.C. So I've lived in D.C. all but 6 years of my life, 7 years of my life. And I rejoined a consulting firm and then got a really lucky break. I got an offer to join a great entrepreneur and a great person named David Bradley, who 10 years earlier had started a company that's now become 3 different companies, the advisory board, the corporate executive board, and the education advisory board. David had done the heavy lifting of figuring out a business formula. That's hard, really hard. And I was lucky enough to come on board to help stamp that out, which is also hard. Execution and getting stuff done and growing companies and hiring people and managing teams, hard. But David had done the heavy lifting. I was through that good fortune. By the time I was 35 years old, I'd been the CEO and chairman of 2 public companies. And I guess I graduated. I decided to move on and try something different. I was playing around with some business things, baseball, which Dave might want to talk about at some point. And that was going well. And when I was in my early 40s, I got a call from Mark Warner. People know who Mark Warner is?
Can I just interrupt there? Because I want to ask you something. Because you gave me advice when I left the Carlyle Group to basically change and take a year.
Yes.
So why would anybody, first of all, it's unusual to be CEO of a publicly traded company at 35, but why would you leave a job as CEO at 35 and have no parachute and just say, I'm going to do something different?
I'm not saying it was rational. But I think, I just been very lucky. I've been doing it for 12, 13 years. There were good people to take over, people who would do an even better job. And I figured it would be an opportunity to try something new. So that's when I started investing in businesses. I think probably what might seem like the biggest crazy thing was I got a call as my new businesses were sort of ramping up from Warner.
Right.
Who had just been the very successful governor of Virginia. And he was a business person before that, which is how I knew him. And he applied a lot of his business learnings and experience to operating the state of Virginia. President Obama, when he was campaigning, said, I'm going to create a chief performance officer for the U.S. government because government's too slow, too bureaucratic, and we can improve the performance by bringing in business best practices. And that was my first job. Warner said, I just got a call from the White House personnel office. They're looking for a business person to come in. Just for kicks, I gave him your name. I doubt you'll ever hear from them. And really, he said, really to mess with, he likes my wife, Mary, much more than he likes me, really to mess with Mary and hopefully get you out of the house. I gave him your name. And then 2 weeks later, President Obama announced that I was coming on one of those no longer existing radio, Saturday morning radio talks that used to happen every week, which no longer happen. And lo and behold, I was in government with a goal to try it for 18 months. We can pick up on that later.
And it's rare for someone to do as well in the private sector and in government. It's many different skill sets. I mean, government is very process-oriented. It's more collaborative. So what skills did you learn from business and being an entrepreneur that you've successfully applied in government? And what skills did you learn in business that are not effective in government?
Well, look, I think we need more business people in government. I think that'd be a very good thing. But it's not all business people. There was a famous CEO who's no longer with us named Jack Welch. Have people heard of Jack Welch? Jack Welch was sort of known for his very tough management style. I didn't know him personally, but when you read about him, my way or the highway, and it was very effective for a period of time. Jack Welch, or a Jack Welch-like person, would not do particularly well in government, maybe even though he did well in the private sector. So I think it takes a certain type of business person, more collaborative, very focused on, this is what I think I helped bring from the private sector, focused on building teams and how you manage teams and set priorities and hold each other accountable. There's an amazing lack of focus in government, in White Houses, Democrat, Republican, on human resources, recruiting, retention, development, occasionally out-counseling. Very little of that goes on. And I think where I've been able to make a contribution is actually by focusing on that, focusing on making sure that the president has the right team in the White House and the right team across the cabinet. People say, what is the chief of staff job all about? The operative word is not chief. The president is the chief. It's staff. And my job, I think I'm doing my job okay if the president has the right team and that team's functioning as a team and holding each other accountable.
Let me ask you a question about managing pressure. You and I have talked about this. We've talked about sleeping problems, which I won't talk about publicly, but you've had two of perhaps the most challenging high-pressure jobs of anybody not essentially running a military campaign. Yeah. So, first of all, President Obama, his signature and perhaps most important initiative was creating health care coverage for tens of millions of Americans. But when he set it up, the website didn't work, okay? And he was just getting crushed every day. And then President Biden, when he took office, you were running the transition, the country was shut down, we had 20 million Americans out of work, and you were put in charge of not a policy issue, but getting the vaccine in arms. And so how did you manage the pressure I just remember the intensity of the focus and the pressure in those circumstances.
Well, first of all, the COVID 18 months was far and away the hardest thing I've done in my career. And it was because of the stress and the pressure and the fact that people were dying and getting very sick. People were losing their loved ones. And at the same time, even though we had a vaccine that was so effective, a significant portion of the population didn't want to take that vaccine, or certainly needed a lot of convincing. I think it comes down to routine and discipline. I mentioned I came here this morning at 5:45 and discovered the track is under construction.
That wouldn't have happened as President Alger's fault. So
I'm sure it'll be a brilliant athletic facility. Every morning, no matter what, no matter how little sleep or how many demands, I work out. Every evening, with very few exceptions, I'm home by 8 o'clock and I have dinner with my wife and whatever kids are willing to be with us. And I have a routine on the weekends that carves out some time. So, it's amazing how much you look forward to that Friday evening dinner with Stuart's daughter and husband, who are dear friends, when you get it on the calendar and you do it. And so you gotta build in family, friends, exercise, and then it's really all about what I talked about earlier, with getting the right team. I believe when you have the right team, diverse, experienced, people who are about it for the right set of reasons, which I think is generally low ego, who want to be part of a team and share a vision, you can capture any opportunity or you can deal with any crisis. And if you don't have that team, you're screwed and you got to fix it. So I think it's when you come to the table. This morning I had a meeting on the port strike, followed by a meeting on Helene recovery. I left the Situation Room on the Middle East, President and Vice President chairing a meeting, to come here. In each one of those meetings, I look around the table and I know, as hard as those problems are, we've got the right team of people thinking about it. And they're functioning as a team. They have each other's back. They celebrate the victories. They hold each other accountable. So all the stress goes into making sure you have that right team.
And you've had different roles in the White House. You were an advisor when you were the National Economic Council director, which you had a staff, but basically you were the president's chief economic advisor. And now you're really chief. Do you like being an advisor or chief or running things better?
Look, I think where I bring the greatest contribution, broken record, is the team. And so I think the ability to have a larger team is something that I thrive on. And I think that it's any job in the White House is an incredible privilege, right? And I think that's what makes government service so special, is you can be around a table and occasionally, virtually or literally around a table, occasionally make a small contribution to something that matters to millions of people's lives, tens of millions of people's lives. So I think if you have the opportunity to walk into the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Veterans Affairs Department, the White House compound, and serve in any capacity, that's what makes it extraordinary.
A lot of what hits your place is totally outside of your control. So right now, one can imagine the president's focus on the economy, hurricane relief, which you couldn't anticipate 10 days ago, the war in Gaza, now the war in Lebanon. How do you manage those priorities, and what are, if you had to rank the president's biggest challenges right now, how would you rank them?
I think the biggest challenges right now are the Middle East, Ukraine, on the international side. And domestically, I think the economy is in a heck of a lot better shape, But, we still have challenges there, making sure that working class and middle class people get their fair share. Prices are still too high in certain areas, particularly housing. We have a fundamental supply and demand imbalance in housing that we've got to fix. And then the priority also is the president's had this historic legislative record. I mean, what the president's gotten done in these 3.5 years, this first term, is more than most presidents would get done in 2 terms. But passing the legislation is really just the beginning. In business, it's the equivalent of the strategic plan. It's important. It's like table stakes, a strategic plan. But if you differentiate companies that make it and do really well versus those who don't do very well, it's rarely about the strategic plan. It's about implementation and execution, which is really hard. It's hard in any setting. It's particularly hard in the federal government. And I think that so many people come into government with thinking through, this is different how you came in, thinking through how do I get my signature policy signed into legislation, and how can I be part of that signing ceremony in the Oval Office, where everyone's crowding into the photo, and if you're really, really lucky, you get one of the 6 pens that the president used to sign the bill. That is the beginning, not the end. And a lot of political folks don't come into government doing what you did, which is run an agency so effectively and make a huge difference through your implementation, your execution, your leadership. We need to do a better job at implementing and executing. So when coming back to your question, the president's very focused on, yes, it's a huge deal that we've gotten all this historic legislation, but we have to implement it and execute it to make a difference in people's lives. So he's holding the team very accountable to execution. One last thing on that. You mentioned the website. The Affordable Care Act was a huge piece of legislation. It took 14 months to get done and almost didn't get done. Look at what it's done for people's lives now. Tens of millions of people have health insurance who wouldn't have it. Pre-existing conditions are covered. That bill, when it was signed, then Vice President Biden was caught on a hot mic characterizing that bill. Does anyone remember what he said? Tom, what did he say?
I can't say it in public company, but the big effing deal.
Yes. Tom was on the Hill making sure this got done. It was a big effing deal almost fell apart, and we wouldn't have any of these benefits today because of a lousy website. So think about that. That highlights the importance of execution, implementation, leadership, operations in government, and is why we need more business people, more private sector people to come in and help out.
You mentioned the president's legislative success, and he went through a very difficult period, ultimately made the decision not to run. Love to ask you about that. But what do you, and now he's got, I guess, 3 months to go or so. What do you think historians will write about in terms of his greatest legacy?
It's a good question. If I had to boil it down to 3 things, I think he not only has led an incredible recovery of the economy, but he's reshaped the economy. We're now investing in America. We're investing in the middle class. We're building the economy from the bottoms up and the middle out rather than the tops down. And I think that will not only be seen as an extraordinary recovery, which he, along with the private sector and the Fed, orchestrated, but also that he's reshaped the economy for decades to come. The second is think about when he decided to run after that terrible event in Charlottesville, and the state of our democracy, witnessed by January 6th as the extreme. I think he has helped restore and preserve democracy. And the third is international. I was lucky enough to go with the president on his first international trip, which wasn't until June of 2021, because everything was done virtually because of COVID. I was doing COVID coordinator role at the White House at the time. I went, because this was mentioned in the introduction of you, Dave, because we had secured the first $500 million doses of Pfizer vaccine to donate to the world. So I went to the G7 in Cornwall, England, with the president. And I'd been in Zoom meetings of different global leader meetings, but to be in person, the relief of having President Biden back on the world stage, in contrast to how many global leaders viewed his predecessor, was extraordinary. And across this 4 years, the president has really restored America's position in the world, which is so important. So I would say economy, democracy, global leadership.
One of the other things you've done in your career, where I had the privilege of working with you, was on the presidential transition, I think. And so Jeff led the Biden transition into office, which I would say was the best transition effort in the history of the United States, amid the most difficult circumstances of any transition in the history of the United States. Because the country was shut down, we had a president that did not recognize the outcome of the election and then delayed the transition after President-elect Biden was declared president-elect. So can you just give us a comment on the importance of transition planning, and also what are you doing now as White House Chief of Staff to prepare for either eventuality? Obviously, we know that you prefer a particular candidate, but you also have to, under the law, prepare in case your preferred candidate doesn't win.
I do think President Biden, Vice President Harris's transition was, as Dave said, the best transition ever under arguably the most difficult circumstances. And why was that? Team, focus, and Dave was a key partner in that. We worked closely together on the transition. Look, transitions are really hard and really important.
I didn't hear that last part. Can you say that again?
Really hard and really important. And there's only 78 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day. And particularly if you're going from a Republican administration to a Democratic or vice versa, there is a ton of work to do. The number one part of it is personnel. Who's going to be in the White House? Who are the cabinet secretaries going to be? There are thousands of political appointees who do all the work. Some of them Senate confirmed, that's a longer lead time. Many of them, thousands not. And how do you get that team together so they can enter day one? Why is it so important to enter day one? A, it's a big, important government to run, right? But also that first 100 days is where a lot of work gets done, a lot of legislative work and other work. You have to hit the ground running. And it's personnel, as we just talked about, putting the team together, which is a huge recruiting operation. It's figuring out policy priorities. So what's the 100-day plan? What are the policy priorities? And then you're walking in with a responsibility, as we talked about, to operate efficiently and effectively a massive organization called the federal government. So you need people landing shortly after the election at these agencies to understand what's going on, interacting with career staff, and outgoing political folks to get a sense of what are the priorities, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the risks. So by the time within a week after the election, we had a 1,000-person transition organization. And by all metrics, it did incredibly well. but it still feels like not enough given the scale of the challenge. We have, thanks to some legislation that Senator Kaufman, who was former chief of staff to President Biden back in the 80s, Senator Biden back in the 80s, he put together legislation when he was a senator, Kaufman did, that governs transitions. And we have a responsibility, a very good responsibility, to do as much as we can to get ready for any candidate who wins, Republican or Democrat or someone else. And so we're doing that work to make sure that we're ready to accept their landing teams at the agencies, that we have briefing books that are nonpartisan so that people can get up to speed quickly on the opportunities and the risk and the vulnerabilities. So there's a bunch of work going on right now, and we want to make sure that work is done at an A+ standard.
Okay. So you have a short period of time left. At one point when you were in the private sector, you thought about buying the Nationals. When you leave government, are you going to buy a baseball team, or what comes next?
So what was interesting about the Nationals was baseball to some extent, but a startup. I grew up in D.C., as we talked about. There was no baseball team. I drove to Baltimore, so the old Memorial Stadium, which was a solid hour and 15 minutes.
You like the O's too, but...
Yeah, I like the O's too. Yeah. They're a good team. But the opportunity to create something that didn't exist was what made it so appealing. So I was very involved. I co-led a group with a guy named Fred Malik 20 years ago, and it was about bringing baseball back to D.C., working closely with the mayor and the city council to attract baseball back here, which happened. And when that happened, people assumed that we would be the ownership group because we'd done all that work. Everyone except for Major League Baseball, who owned the team, they said, now that we've got D.C. as a great location, committed to a stadium, let's auction the franchise. And it came down to us and the group that won it, the Lerner Group, which I was very disappointed in at the time. But I remember my mom saying to me something that has always sort of sat sort of well, but not well with me, which is everything happens for a reason, which when you're sort of a control freak like me, you're like, no, that's not true. But I don't think I'd be sitting here today talking about this extraordinary privilege I've been part of, to be part of the government if I'd won that team. Yeah. I doubt that would have happened. So maybe my mom was right after all. So I don't think baseball's in the future because there's no startup opportunity to bring baseball back to D.C. Last time when I left the Obama administration, I thought even bigger, which is growing up here, there was no good bagel in D.C. Yes. So what did I do? I do what any nerd does. I had a small team of people trying to figure out business opportunities, but I said as a fun project, let's go around the country and figure out what are the coolest delis, what are the coolest bagels. They took photos, brought back menus, put together a business plan, and then it was sort of like, okay, now what do we do? Because what were we missing? An entrepreneur. And then I lucked out and found a guy who grew up around here named Andrew Dana, who had left a good business job to start a pizza shop and always wanted to do a bagel shop. And lo and behold, he's created this incredible business called Call Your Mother. And I always say, well, I gave you the business plan. And he's like, you want me to show you that business plan? It has absolutely nothing to do with what we do here. But he's done an extraordinary job. So maybe there's another bagel shop or something.
I had a bagel from there on Saturday. It was
good.
Really good. Okay.
How was it?
It was fantastic.
Excellent.
I brought a gluten-free one for my wife, too, which was
those are pretty good.
All right, my last question, then we have a few student questions, is you have had this extraordinary career. We have a number of students who are studying business, public affairs. Mm-hmm. We have a great public affairs school, thanks to Vicki Wilkins. What's your advice for them on pursuing a career that gives them the flexibility to go in and out of government and develop the skills that you developed?
Sometimes people ask me, what's the better sequence? Government first, then business? Or I don't think there's a correct answer to that. I think, one of the more macro pieces of advice I'd give all of you is you all are stars. You wouldn't be here if you weren't, and you've done incredibly well in every step of your education and your life and your professional exposure. The only downside of that is it can make you a little risk averse. Like, oh, geez, I can't screw up now. So I've got to do the next thing that people generally do in that progression. And I think that might be totally right answer. But I think when really talented, committed, bright people take some risk, life rewards smart people taking risks disproportionately. So I don't want you to become risk averse, ironically, because you've done so well. And therefore, I think, capture the opportunity, even if it feels risky or uncomfortable. I'm not saying do silly things. Don't jump off a building without a bungee cord, right? Have the bungee cord attached, right? But take some risk, because you know what? It might actually work out. But even if it doesn't, you've learned a ton, and you'll apply it to the next thing, and you will find the next thing. So I think the answer to that question is, if someone right now is on a campaign like Katie, where's Katie? Katie's back here. Katie was at the University of Delaware. She was really interested in then Vice President Biden's campaign. She jumped on the campaign. Katie has spent the last 4 years in the West Wing.
Pretty cool.
That was risky what she did. She could have done lots of other things, right? To join a campaign. Who knows if candidate Biden's even going to be the nominee, whether he's going to win. Doesn't pay much, if anything. And look where she's ended up. And, I don't want to speak for Katie. There's a chance that her next move will be to go to the private sector. But that was a cool opportunity that she created by her willingness to take some risk. If there's a cool business opportunity, grab that, or some other opportunity, a non-for-profit opportunity. But I think you got to be opportunistic, particularly in your 20s. That is the time to take chances, learn new things, discover what you like, what you don't like. And generally what you like is what you're really good at. Maybe as you enter your next decade, you say, okay, I have to focus a little more. Now I'm going to try to become world-class at something and be more focused. But if you're in different sectors and different industries, for-profit, not-for-profit during your 20s, and throughout your career for that matter, I think that's a good thing.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions. We're going to go with Lindy first. Just introduce yourself. And by the way, when we finish, if you all could just let Jeff leave. And I also want to just give a shout out to the Secret Service.
Brian, I think that's the first time you've ever gotten a round of applause. Yeah.
They do an extraordinary
job. People say much worse things about you.
They put their life on the line for other people.
They do.
And thank you for what you do.
It is an extraordinary organization. You find organizations that have that flywheel going of really extraordinary people about it for the right set of reasons, talented, come together. And then what happens? It builds on itself. And that is the Secret Service.
So, okay, great. Just introduce yourself.
I'm Lindy Murphy. I'm a senior here studying economics. Thank you for coming to talk to us today. You talked a lot about how government could benefit from a more business-like process or more business people. But I'm wondering, you can't go in and fire half the people that work for the government and replace them with private sector people. So how do you implement that? How do you make it so business people or private sector people are incentivized to join government to make this sort of thing work better?
Well, let me start by saying one of the things I didn't know before I came in to OMB as that first job, and was critical for me was, look, I'm a firm believer that joy at work, having fun, enjoying, is all about who you work with. And I was lucky enough in the private sector to work with extraordinary people. I didn't know what was going to happen when I walked into a political environment and a career environment. And I got to tell you, like in any organization, there's a tale of people who are underperformers or aren't about it for the right set of reasons or have bad attitudes. But it is pretty extraordinary, the career civil servants and what they do. And it's inspiring. And, there are no stock options. There's no big comp plan. They're doing it for reasons that are self-evident. And that was when I ended up coming in for what I thought would be 18 months and then returned home, figuratively, literally. I stayed all 8 years. It was that ability to make a small contribution that matters to millions of people's lives, and it was the quality of the team. So look, I think I don't think we need to radically change government and have mostly private sector folks, but I think we need more. And we've made it too hard. Senate confirmation's too hard. It takes too long to get a job in the federal government. We have to streamline that. The federal government is just too slow. And if it was as slow as it wouldn't survive as a company at that speed, and we have to speed it up. So one of the things we're doing right now is working on artificial intelligence. And how should the government create some guardrails around artificial intelligence so we get the benefits, but we minimize the risk? When I think about the normal regulatory process in the federal government, it takes a year or 2 years. In a year or 2 years, it's going to be completely different. It's way too slow, so you'd be generations behind. So we have to come up with a new way of doing it, and part of that is involving a lot of business folks, partnering with the private sector. So some of the answer to your question is more public-private partnerships too, businesses working together with government. So speed, recruiting more people in, public-private partnerships, all part of levers we need to pull in order to get better and faster. And it's not just private sector people coming in; it's private sector practices coming in. Most technology projects, or too many technology projects in the federal government, don't work because they're too slow and they don't have the discipline. We don't have the discipline of deciding a project's not going to work and no longer investing in it. Bringing in private sector people, but also private sector best practices, has made technology in the government much better.
Just a comment, this team concept, academia is not fast either. But if you have the right team, one of the things I'm most proud of doing here is in a 6-week period last spring, we said we have to change our curriculum to infuse artificial intelligence. And we have a good team at Kogod, and we did it. So our first-year students, they're learning AI.
But I think that's because this place is so entrepreneurial, right? I can imagine at a different institution, the AI curriculum would take 2 years to get approved, at which point it would be obsolete. So that's part of the entrepreneurial nature of this place.
And we have a good team.
Which is so cool.
All right, Ash, is Ash here? Last question, okay.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm a political science major here. I'm a freshman. My question is about your time spent in the Obama administration. During your tenure in the Federal Budget Office, spending increased significantly. This has contributed to an ever-growing national debt. How do you justify such high levels of spending, and do you believe this approach is sustainable in the long term?
Good question. I don't think we can end on that, though. That's too serious. We'll take one more after that. So, look, we do have a fundamental challenge here, and spending has gone up across time. A lot of that is driven by Medicare and Social Security, which is driven in turn by demographics. We have an older population and people are living longer, and we have to recognize that. And at the same time, our revenue has been pretty flat. So we need revenue, meaning taxes. We need to have a higher tax base, while at the same time understanding where we're not spending efficiently, where we can spend less. But it's like a business. If you're going to improve a business financial performance, you work on two sides of the equation, the revenue and the cost structure. We need to do both in the federal government, but you can't do it on the cost side alone. It's not even a close call. We need more revenue. Okay. Last question, give me a fun one.
Let's see, I'm gonna go with Maddie, because she left lacrosse practice to, is she here?
Hi, yes.
Okay, she didn't even
Apologize for my
change or
outfit.
shower, okay.
Yes, I'm going to go back there after this. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm honored to be the last question. I promise it won't be as serious.
And just introduce yourself and what year you are.
My name is Maddie Spratt, and I'm a senior, and I am on the women's lacrosse team. But my question for you, so going back to your concept of teams, it seems as though you have a lot of pride in how you've led and managed all your teams, but what is the difference that you feel in motivating and building out these teams from the private sector now into the public sector?
I think there's many more similarities than there are differences. I mentioned it before. I mean, an obvious difference in the private sector, you spend a fair amount of time on compensation. How do I create the right levels of compensation, the right incentives to drive and motivate people? That doesn't really exist in the in the federal government, in the public sector. So which makes, as I talked about it, even more extraordinary that you have people who are working as hard as they are, doing what they're doing without that compensation lever. I think the other thing that's a little different, is the metrics aren't as clear. You know, when we're in business, we have a pretty good sense of the 3 or 4 things that we're trying to measure and motivate teams around. Maybe it's profitability, revenue growth, R&D, success or failure. It's harder because it's not just about a bottom line or a single metric. And how do you hold yourself accountable for performance when the metrics aren't as clear? And how do you hold the team accountable for performance? How do you know how well you're doing? And that means you have to invest more in figuring out what the right metrics are. So I would say it's 80% the same stuff, getting the right team, diverse, about it for the right set of reasons, experience, performing as a team. The 20% probably goes to compensation, metrics, and a few other areas.
Let me thank Katie, first of all, for facilitating Jeff coming here. Jeff's team is great. Let me thank Jeff Zients for... Thank you for sharing your time and wisdom here. And most importantly, is Katie there? Okay, Katie. Okay. Most importantly, thank you for your extraordinary service to our country.
Let me say one last word. I was so excited to be here today. And it's for a lot of reasons, but the number one reason is when I'm with people like all of you, our future, it makes me so optimistic about our future. It's a hard world we live in. There's a lot of good things happening. There's a bunch of stuff that's not good that we have to fix. But all of you as our future leaders makes me very, very optimistic about the future of this country. So thank you. Thank you.